Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming in such a great number. Today's speech is about the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. And before we start, I would like to say that Nietzsche was born in 1844 near Leipzig in Germany and died in 1900. He lived his last 10 years practically as a madman. But he was educated and very well versed into classical philology, and in analyzing humanity, he made use of two concepts from Greek mythology, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. He took the former as a symbol of the rationality and the latter of creative energies in human being. He favored the latter. In philosophy, he took no sides. He took his own side against Schopenhauer's pessimistic dictum, will to life. He optimistically called for will to power. In a time when Christianity, democracy, and socialism criticized one another, he criticized all of them. He called for new values and morality that are not grounded on the weak ones, but on the contrary, on the strong ones. He tried to convince us that God is dead and that the evolution has not finished yet. The next stage of the evolution is the superhuman. Metaphorically, he placed the superhuman on a circus rope, walking rope, and the starting point is the stage of the apes, and the finish is the stage of the superhuman. Whoever can cross the rope can become a superhuman. And to finish, Nietzsche exerted a tremendous influence in the subsequent literature and art. For example, Richard Strauss wrote a composition bearing the same title as one of the most famous Nietzsche's books, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the idea of superhuman, we can also see it as a background in the cult Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim McGee will further elaborate on Nietzsche's philosophy.
Okay, good evening. Well, that was a great introduction. You actually helped me out there a lot, Alex. Thanks. Covered the first part of my speech anyway. A little bit of background on his life. It actually kind of feels like right now, a period in Nietzsche's career when an article was released by a fellow professor, and he, in his class, at first he had about 23, 24 students enrolled. After the article was released, basically criticizing Nietzsche, 2 people showed up or enlisted, and they weren't even philosophy majors. So anyway, kind of I was going to say it kind of feels like that, but it's kind of an interesting guy because he's probably one of the most misunderstood philosophers in recent times. And I think probably some of the reasons for that were that we had two of the biggest sources for popularizing philosophy in recent times that most people even today still reference were written by Will Durant and Bertrand Russell, neither of which gave Nietzsche the serious intellectual treatment that he does deserve, I believe. And also, anything that's remotely connected with European continental philosophy tends today to be rejected out of hand by analytic philosophers, and the analytics, of course, being the Anglo-Saxons, the English-speaking sect that kind of, we've got that split from Kant, or into continental and Anglo-Saxon. The Anglo-Saxons tend to completely disregard Nietzsche, and I think it's important for us today to kind of try to look at everyone and get a point of view that they were trying to get across. Okay, so I guess I don't know how much I should go into any further on his life itself. I guess some things to be aware of were that his interest in philosophy really got going when he accidentally discovered Schopenhauer's book, The World as Will and Representation. He was in a secondhand bookstore, and he pulls this off the shelf. And from that point on, he digested that book, and then it just set him on a course. It was basically the equivalent to Immanuel Kant discovering David Hume and the problem of induction. He said it woke him from his intellectual slumber. And from that point, that was kind of the point of no return for the development of his philosophy. I guess something else that's important to be aware of too is just the cultural backdrop of Europe at that time. You've got two major factors that really form the background of Nietzsche's thought. The first one would be the fact that Darwinism was becoming more popular. Everybody was reading Darwin at the time, and basically we've got this retreat in the way we look at man, and people like from the Darwinistic perspective, there's not much difference between men and animals. And the other factor is that when he made the claim, he was talking about the death of God, and that kind of takes place within that context. Because when he said the death of God, whether God is dead, when he was talking about the death of God, it was basically a cultural observation on his part. He was saying there were less people were believing in the idea of God, and that was he saw that as a major shift, and basically the whole subsequent course of his work kind of takes place in reaction to Schopenhauer, the idea that God is dead, and so those would be the essential things to be aware of. Yeah, and he's trying to actually save mankind in a way. He's trying to be a little bit of a hero when you look back on it, because the general climate, he characterized the influence of Darwinism, the death of God. He characterized that as nihilism, basically meaning that our lives no longer have any purpose. There's no meaning in life anymore. Before, you were born into a world where you had a job and God was taking care of everything. All of a sudden, that's gone. There's a void, and not just and mainly that's got ramifications for our meaning or our sense of purpose, but also for our value system. And this is the problem as he sees it. I mean, where do we ground our values? For the last 2,000 years, Western society has grounded their values with this idea that they were given from God. But if you've got this change happening where, okay, most of the people don't believe in God anymore. So where do you create this moral basis now? This factor of nihilism that he was actually rallying against and writing against. He was trying to help people to escape from it, because the general tendency, even today, it hasn't gone away. I would argue Nietzsche wasn't as successful as maybe some of us would have liked to have seen, because it still characterizes the world today. You still see people walking around. What's the meaning of life? Oh, my life feels like it has no purpose, and that's exactly what he was trying to prevent, and to get us thinking about. Okay, so moving on. Basically, the real thrust of his work begins with, as Alex mentioned, with the idea of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. In The Birth of Tragedy, any of you guys read that? First book? No? Okay. The Birth of Tragedy is basically, he's trying to find out, he's basically looking at where did greatness come from, and how did the Greeks write these magnificent tragedies. And he traced it to two factors, and he said it was a mixture of what he called the Apollonian, which is a form-giving force, and the Dionysian, which is kind of unrestrained passion. And he saw and he said it was the balance between those that created this beautiful art in Greece. And he spent some time thinking about that, and that actually sent him on another launch point, and into what later became his ideas around the will to power, because he spent a lot of time thinking about how art and high culture arose in Greece, and he's also trying to enable a climate for that today. And basically, so that's basically what he meant by the Apollonian and the Dionysian. You've got the form-giving force, and you have the passionate, unrestrained, kind of drunken frenzy, if you will, of Dionysus, right? The god of wine. So I think he chose his images fairly carefully there, but that's what he ran with anyway. Okay, in terms of the development of his method, he's got a large number of major themes. He deals with the relationship between life and art and philosophy, cultivation of character, the true self, education, genuine wisdom versus mere knowledge, psychology, ethics, morality, theory of knowledge. I mean, the list goes on. Scientific method. He really is all over the place. And one of the key things that you have to be aware of if you're approaching Nietzsche is that he does not believe in systems. And this is one of the reasons he's probably been rejected by, historically as well. Because at the time he was writing, everybody, you weren't a real philosopher unless you were coming up with a system. But he actually had a sound basis for rejecting systems, because he said, well, wait a second, look at Kant, he's building a system. Look at Schopenhauer, he built a system. There's a problem here. He says, because you're making fundamental assumptions about the world that you're not questioning. And that's really why he rejected them, basically for that reason, because he said we have to be questioning everything. You can't take any one premise and just assume it's true because it fits what you happen to think. I mean, you have to be it's unrelenting questioning. Like Nietzsche kind of fashions himself in the tradition of Socrates that way. So that's an important thing to be aware of in terms of his method. It's he does not try to build a system. He ends up coming on to major concepts, which I'm going to try and discuss in a little bit more detail, but that's something he does reject. There's a little quote from him here, and to sum up kind of his view on it. The will to a system. In a philosopher, morally speaking, a subtle corruption, a disease of the character. Amorally speaking, his will to appear more stupid than he is. I am not bigoted enough for a system, and not even for my system. Okay, so he considers it obviously very intellectually dishonest to be constructing these things. So that's kind of something we need to be aware of when we're reading him. So moving on from that, those are some of the early developments in his thought. Like obviously the reaction against nihilism, the fact that we're dealing with this cultural landscape where God is dead, there's no meaning. So he's thinking about these things. They're all in the back of his mind, and his philosophy is kind of a development over time, and all of his work has to be understood as a broader whole. You can't just take one piece and assume you've got the grasp. You really do need to. It takes some time to read. You should try to read as much as you can if you approach it. In terms of the revaluation of all values, one of the things that people often get disappointed about when they approach Nietzsche is I think like a lot of times they expect that he's got a new set of 10 Commandments. He's got new tablets, just like Zarathustra talked about. Well, actually, he doesn't. You're not going to find that in Nietzsche. He doesn't say, this, and this, or more. That's not what he's trying to do at all. He basically wants to cultivate a habit of mind in people who are studying him. He thinks that we should take everything we hold to be honest or virtuous. He thinks all of that is fair game. Question it. Like even little things such as saying thank you, which most people probably would say is actually a moral thing. How many people here, show of hands, that would say saying thank you is a moral thing to do? You know it?
Yeah, it's a moral thing, yeah.
Well, I mean,
Really,
yeah.
thank you, it's going to be like, rude, eh?
For sure, yeah, but that's the thing. I think most people do that. We all do that. Like I don't know very much Chinese, but one of the basic things I do know is shi shi ni. Okay, and it's all called. What's that? Yeah. But yeah, that's one of the basic things that we do. But he argues that at one point, well, actually, if you think about it, what it's doing, this gets into the will to power. I'll discuss this in a second. But basically, the origin of us saying thank you is because one person in a stronger position is doing something for you, and that all of a sudden puts the person who's in a position of strength in a position of weakness because they're doing something for another person. They need gratitude to reaffirm that, in fact, their power is not diminished in this situation, and they demand that thank you. And that's actually the origin of it, is what at one point he discusses. So everything is fair game for questioning, including saying thank you when next time you buy your bottle of pop or whatever you're getting at the store. Okay, and basically that's it for the revaluation of values. He doesn't lay anything out specifically. It's just unrelenting questioning of are your morals moral? Is what you should be asking yourself, right? That's what he would argue. Okay, moving on here. Okay, so basically the three central concepts that you hear most discussion with regard to Nietzsche on would be the overman, the eternal recurrence and the will to power. The overman is basically the person who conquers himself, their passions. When you get control of your of all the passions inside you, you all of a sudden you've dominated them. You're on your way to being what he would call the overman. It's a self-mastery issue. It's equivalent in Chinese to like Lao Tzu or Confucius, talking about the sage. Their word for it would be the sage. Nietzsche calls it the Übermensch, or the overman. It's the same thing. It's the person who conquers himself. Okay, and from there he goes on. When we talk about the eternal return, he in his book The Gay Science, he gives us a little depiction of a demon, and he says, imagine a demon bent over and whispered in your ear. Imagine you had to live this life over and over and over and over again. He called it eternal recurrence. And he said, your development as a person, your answer to that question really hangs on your response. The life you live now, how many people here, just honestly, show of hands, would you do it again and again and again, over and over again? If it was a fact of the matter you were going to be reincarnated, but your life has to play out exactly as it has so far, who would do it again?
Not me.
Nobody?
No. Ben.
I might.
I will. Superman would, right?
Some people, yeah. That's
So
the.
far. That's
So far.
Well, that's the question, though. He asks you, and he asks you to consider that, and that kind of it's kind of your answer to that is basically hanging partially on his total philosophy. He sums up his entire thought in a Latin phrase, amor fati, love of fate. It's very much Nietzsche is very much a philosopher of life, and like he said, he's trying to get our culture out of nihilism. That's his overarching. That's one of his overarching objectives, and that's why he says where you're at in your life is kind of depending on your answer to that question of the eternal return. It's a thought experiment, is what it is. That's the important thing to be aware of with regard to it. Now the will to power. There's a couple. I wrote down a couple of. I compared definitions of power from let's see. I've got 4 different people that you can compare. For Nietzsche, he's a very specific definition of that word power that gets misinterpreted, and it's basically self-overcoming. That's what he means by power. That's his definition, self-overcoming. So you've got Thomas Hobbes, who said, power is a tool of security. Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power over nature, and truth is to be utilized as a means to new comforts. It's a very English response. Bertrand Russell said, power is the ability to make others do what they otherwise would not do. Okay, and for Nietzsche, coming to him, he says, power is a state of being that man desires for its own sake, and as his own ultimate end, and his own self-overcoming. That's how he defines power. So when you approach it, and you have to be aware of that. Like this picture, if you've read the history of Western philosophy, Bertrand Russell obviously did. He wrote that while he was in exile from England, and he was teaching a high school class for adults. It's not really a book to be taken seriously, and he obviously didn't spend any time reading Nietzsche, because if he did, he wouldn't have went on a rant about, basically Nietzsche being a proto-fascist, which is what he does in that text. And that's absolutely not what he's talking about. A more accurate translation of the will to power is very much in line with Chinese philosophy, which is where you conquer yourself and your own passions, and you take control of yourself. And he says, and one of the things Nietzsche points out is beware of the person that can't do that. He who can't control himself looks outward. They start trying to dominate others. And so when you look at the will to power, you can actually, if you think about it, you can put yourself on a scale. You go from the lowest level of the will to power is a person who just wants to inflict pain and hurt on others. That's the lowest level. They have no control over their passions. They want to do damage to other people. The mid-level would be people that are trying to, they're basically the average person looking for envy, admiration. Maybe they even want to help other people. Probably all of us here, I would say, would be, like what we're doing here would be in the middle level of the will to power. You know, like we're here, everybody's trying to learn something from one another. Hopefully that we can use that somehow to our own benefit, to, you know, just make us better people in the long run. So we'd be on the mid-level there. And he would put the highest level of the development of the will to power as the person who has conquered themselves, the overman. Person who's got, you don't have to worry about these passions that are inside you anymore, because you've developed reason, which is also an offshoot of the will to power. But your internalization and development of your own reasoning power has hit such a level where those passions no longer, they can't do anything to you. Because you're in control of yourself. That's a developed will to power. And that's basically, so that's how he defines it. And it's basically self-overcoming. What's Nietzsche's definition of power? Self-overcoming. That's basically it. It's actually very, very much in line with Chinese philosophy, as I've mentioned. Okay, and the other idea maybe we can be aware of before we get going here. How are we doing for time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. He introduces another idea in his work, sublimation. If you've read any Sigmund Freud, Freud runs with that idea, and he's given a lot of credit for that, but actually Nietzsche was the one who developed that conception of it. Freud was a fan of Nietzsche. He actually remarked, he said he knew himself better than any other man who ever wrote a book, okay, or put words into print. And so Freud runs with that same idea that we have our sexual passions, and when we can somehow bury those and turn it into something productive, we get beautiful art. Right? We're expecting that China is going to be a bastion of beautiful art in the next few years with this gap between men and women, right? You're going to see a lot of sublimation happening in China over the next few years, right? So anyway, we may have some of the most beautiful paintings ever made. Who knows? We'll see. So that's basically what he's talking about there. He introduced that idea. Freud is obviously given credit for it, and we get to the end basically of the introduction, which would be, you know, what's the meaning of life? Because Nietzsche's philosophy actually deals with that. Again, this is how he's trying to get the culture out of nihilism. Where do I get meaning? Where do I get purpose? And the purpose is essentially that you're born into a world. Your life is just, things can be chaotic. It's like somebody came in and your life is like somebody coming and dropping a puzzle over the table in a mess. You have to put pieces together. That's kind of how he interprets it, and he says, coming from the old Christian values, where your meaning was given to you, you didn't have to do anything because God told you what your meaning is. Nietzsche doesn't buy that. He says that there's no, wait a second. There actually is a purpose to life, but nature gives you life, but nature's an imperfect thing. She too needs redemption. You have to do something else. You're not spoon-fed your meaning in the world. You also have to do something with your intellectual abilities, your skills that you can perform. You've got to do something and turn it into a creative process and be productive to the best of your abilities and make something of your abilities. That's where your meaning will come from when you do that. You can't sit home on your couch and expect your life to gain a sense of meaning. You sort of have to earn your way in the world. You have to use your abilities, and that's where your meaning will actually, your sense of purpose in life will come from doing that. And okay, so that would be his response. I mean, and that's what he argues is the purpose of culture. Like his ideas around culture really are like the generation of a higher culture is where you wind up. Something like the ancient Greeks, for instance. So in conclusion, Nietzsche begs his readers that he begs us to continue questioning. Don't endorse a particular course of action. He says convictions are more dangerous foes of truth than lies, is what he says at one point. And it's just unrelenting questioning and self-overcoming. It's a process that doesn't end for him. And being oneself requires overcoming yourself on a daily basis. Life is a constant process of self-improvement. when you think about the eternal recurrence, you think about all the difficulties in life, and you have to your task is to organize the chaos, and that gives you meaning. And but eventually you have to hit a point where you love the adversity that comes toward you. You don't rebel against it because it's a natural process. When you're faced with problems, you have to be able to love your problems because they're going to teach you something when you approach them. No matter if you win or lose in the situation, you have to love the fact that you've been given these challenges that you have to overcome. And that's kind of and that gets into his, like I said, he summarizes his philosophy in the expression amor fati, love of fate. You just have to be able to love life and get to the point in your life where, when you're thinking about the eternal recurrence and the thought experiment there, would you do it again and again and again if you had to? You have to get yourself in a position where you'll say yes, gladly. And that basically summarizes his philosophy. I made a couple of notes here, but some things that he touches on, like, because his philosophy gets into all aspects of life. Like, at one point he talks about marriage. He says there are two kinds of marriage: that between herd animals that are just running from their own loneliness. They can't be by themselves, so they need somebody else to kind of lose themselves in. But he says, and there's the other kind of marriage between two single ones, people who have conquered themselves and are now they're in a different situation. They're not lonely. They're perfect. They're in a state of self, where they've overcome themselves and they've actually become overmen, if you will. And that's a more healthy relationship to be in. He talks about friendship. Friendship basically being people who educate one another, where you're teaching one another as we go through life. And self-perfection is only possible through suffering. We can't. So the problems that we're given in life, we can't really self-overcome unless we can embrace those problems and accept them and actually love them for the challenges they give us, because it does give us the chance to get to the next level in our development. I don't like to sit and argue completely in favor of something. I made a couple of notes here on things that I personally disagree with. Because one of the things to keep in mind as well is that the best way to be a Nietzschean is to not be a Nietzschean. Nietzsche would not expect anybody to accept anything he says at face value. He expects you to be questioning as well. Some things I personally disagree with that I'm kind of working on at the moment. The idea that we can make a leap of faith in the problems of causality when we accept the will to power hypothesis. I have issues around, I don't think Nietzsche deals with the ideas that Hume brings up, for instance, on causality very well. And as far as I can tell, I don't agree with his rejection out of hand of Schopenhauer, of the dualism of Schopenhauer and Kant, for instance. Nietzsche rejects those things, and I don't think he can. I think he's making a leap of faith. That's something I would myself disagree with him on. And I guess the idea, too, that you run into is that if everyone's assuming that they're powerful enough to make their own rules and not follow any sort of established order, like if everybody decides they're going to become an overman, I mean, like, that could, I don't know, like, that could potentially, in a way, be dangerous. And that's one of the points that Bertrand Russell brings up that I actually did agree with in the history of Western philosophy. So yeah, those are just some food for thought on the end there. But I guess, are there any questions on anything that I mentioned?
We have 4 more minutes. 3 more minutes. If
Four
you
more
want, or
minutes.
3 more minutes.
3 more minutes?
Or if you want, you can end up here.
I think that's good. I think that basically covers the basis. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.